Hello everyone, today we talk introductively about medieval European demographics. It's not the first time we talk about this topic, of course. There is a pretty hefty medieval society playlist where you find all these various aspects, such as agricultural cycles, famines, epidemics, the natality, mortality. We talked a lot about Black Death, of course. So this all gets to the various places we will have to come back on at some point. But let's say giving an overall picture, right? And maybe why not coming back on this two at a time, but just to set this as a bit of a compass, as it can help. Of course, I can't be complete, right, to give a compass on medieval European demographics. I've actually never studied that. I studied something closer to statistics, but say in military history. Today we will partially talk about that. But it's an incredibly foggy topic in many ways because we do not truly know with an important degree of accuracy how many people at different times lived in medieval Europe. We have an overall idea, right? But there are dramatic swings, let's say, in the extremes that historiographically were pointed out. And there are various theories, and it all revolves around method, of course. There is a problem, obviously, lack of sources, especially for the earlier centuries of the Middle Ages. But don't think that until the 14th century we know too much. We have said it many times. Like, we have a pretty concrete idea of the enormous size of the great, say, high medieval civilization, like the one peaking in the 13th century. We'll see it also now. One of the most important actual, criticism here is the comparison with antiquity, by the way, and with Europe as a whole. And people often don't get how big medieval civilization actually was, right? Not just how advanced, how bright, how, of course, everything against the Dark Legend about the Middle Ages, but truly the size of this monster, right? At least in pop culture, it's not even it's not termed even like this in historiography, telling you the truth. This is more or less something I came up with after decades of being in and around, say, medieval history. But it's objectively impressive, and there may be specific reasons why this was not pointed out adequately, but we don't have necessarily time today to address that. In any case, let's again stick to the essentials, in just mechanically, quantitatively, and what this entails. Overall, they can be very banal things to say at some point, but one has to start anyway. So, first of all, demographic data. What are we looking at? Well, of course, the consistency of the population, as we just pointed out. But importantly enough, this gets very interesting, and I'm very interested myself in it, is how was this distributed across the territory? Right. Today we talk essentially about Europe. Right. Naturally, how this changed over time, and so more or less, what were the index of natality and mortality? Right. This, of course, is again a huge topic. These, on the basis of these data that we can't calculate precisely, but that we can get an overall idea of much, of course, of our understanding of the Middle Ages as a whole, not just from a socio-economical point of view, actually, kind of. And you understand that not knowing exactly this data, especially when we are looking at macrodynamics of, say, the Middle Ages, etc., can be, of course, quite frustrating, and can lead, in fact, to different interpretations of the same Middle Ages. And I think you have understood this at this point, that every time I make a video, like, if, let's say, there is a space we have, say, a field we have adequately studied, and we know something quite concrete about that, there is always a reasonable doubt surrounding method, evidence, etc. But also, on a smaller scale, paradoxically, we know more, right? And we can assess that. But never think for an instant that, especially in these bigger topics, there is like a sort of truth about the matter, that you can open a book and say, well, okay, there's a scholar who said that, so it must be it, right? No, right? And say, without digressing on even the methods the scholars use, that varies unavoidably, but that's not even properly meant historically and historiographically to provide with a definitive answer in that sense, right? There are things where you can't get more or less to an exhausted or spent field of research. It's rare, but at that point you can say more or less we know that. These fields here are sometimes ridiculous in the way especially portray themselves or portray specific researches, right? There are money revolving around this, and it's fine as long as you have a world that is able to pay for the good stuff, right? But when there is technologism, climatologism, all this stuff that fundamentally has to sensationalize, to monofactorialize, etc., that's already by itself garbage, and you can actually treat it like that, right? So let's equally and brutally make an assessment, more or less, what was the European demographics, according to some assessment from from antiquity, let's say, to the end of the Middle Ages, right? And let's appreciate more or less the scale of this. I have got people, I don't know, even the videos I made about early Middle Ages say, oh no, this European country had, I don't know, 4 million inhabitants, and I think that it had maybe 8, or etc. So we are at this sort of important difference in scale and debate, right? And that's something that you must, especially as a historian that has, of course, specialized in some sort of time and space, and so in some context that you must appreciate, that sort of also demographic sense is important. Also for a military historian, of course. You must have a bit of a sixth sense, a bit of guts, a bit of an assessment you can make on your own. So let's say at Christ's birth, how big was Europe? Well, we can think something along the line of above 30 million inhabitants, right? Augustan era, right? Around 200 AD, before the 3rd century crisis, let's say, the population of Europe, right, I'm not talking just the Roman Empire, bear in mind, obviously was concentrated there, but there were lots of other peoples within the same continent, was about to reach likely 50 millions, right? Probably didn't get there, but it was about to. 480. Say that the system is starting to be significantly shattered, but there's not the big crack yet. At this point, after substantial destabilization, we can think something along the line of 35 millions. Alright, so there has been a staunch decline in previous centuries. 500 AD, roughly 30 millions. Right? 600 AD, this is the moment of greatest contraction, because the Justinian plague has come to reduce further scale of the population. We are at above 20 millions, right? 20 millions and a few others, right? Now this is debatable naturally, and it's complicated to like, just for every figure that I'm listing now, we could make an entire video, right, saying why do we think that in that century there was such amount of population. By 700 AD, things are actually going back to increase, right? This is very important to understand about the Middle Ages, that overall this phase of the urbanization, the population, overall contraction, etc., it's something that starts at the very beginning, right? It's not even the one that leads just into the Middle Ages. It's just a phase that peaks at a certain point. It's not just the plague per se, but essentially the Middle Ages keep on rising dramatically after that, and not even the Black Death is something so relevant statistically overall, considering the size of the European population later on. There is a debate on this too. It's not to say that the Black Death did not depopulate substantially Europe, that had to essentially keep on rising until the 17th century to reach the prior levels, right? But it's also not just about size. We'll talk about this. It's how also things were represented, right? We all have seen the allegory, say the triumph of that, etc., in late medieval art. But what was happening, say, in the 6th century was substantially worse, right? It would much less means than the one that late medieval Europeans had. 700 AD, around 25 million, perhaps not yet, but still. Naturally, here we're not digressing on where the population was concentrated, mostly in the Mediterranean, of course, right? But and there are different, let's say, levels of growth, right? Even though, say, Northern Europe was less populated and less developed than Southern Europe, throughout the Middle Ages, the former increased more in relative terms, right? But it would take essentially well into the modern age to reach Southern Europe in the first place, and not say everywhere, by the way. 880, right? Charlemagne is crowned in Rome as Roman Emperor. At this point, European population was something above 25 million, right? 980, we think, of course, this is the beginning of the so-called Iron Century. People say, well, yeah, it was a terrible time, etc. But if you look at even the following trend and how, generally speaking, how well medieval Europe recovered in the immediate aftermath of the second invasions, you realize that there likely hadn't been a major contraction, right? At least it's not documented. We don't see plague, for example. That's a very important thing, right? There is a collapse of an empire, the Carolingian one, but you do not have major epidemics. This is interesting compared to previous time. And at the beginning of the 10th century, we have something approaching 30 millions, likely not getting there. By the year 1000, 30 millions are likely reached. In the 12th century, 35 million. Right, these high medieval centuries are very important, very overlooked, because properly the seeds of the boom are planted, right? 12th century is a moment of enormous expansion, tumultuous one, even unregulated one, dangerous, etc. But European civilization eventually is booming at this point, so much so that by the year 1200, population has likely reached 50 millions. And it's not over yet, but there is an important aspect to consider. That is to say, as we've seen, the peak of antiquity here has been not just reached but surpassed. Right? You have more people living in Europe by the year 1200 than in the year 280. Right? And it's a lot, right? This is, say, 200 AD is also a bit the peak of that population overall in antiquity, right? So you realize what by the year 1200 thing was, but the crisis was yet to kick in yet. By the year 1300, we can appreciate perhaps there are debates about this again, but a population surpassing 70 millions. Now this is really a lot, right? And great part of this population was concentrated at this point, like 1/4 of it, slightly less, just in the Italian peninsula. So that gives you a dimension of how unevenly distributed the population was. Then by the year 1400, the situation has changed drastically because the Black Death has kicked in, and it not only that, but it's coming back cyclically, and it will until say the beginning of the 18th century. And we can assess the European population at that point being something like 55 million, right? This crisis, by the way, has struck especially the most densely populated areas, right? For example, the aforementioned Italy passed from something like, 12, 13 millions to likely 8 millions at that point, right? So this is in many ways obvious if you understand the dynamics of epidemic spread. But the interesting thing about this is it doesn't matter how heavy the blow really was. As you know, medieval civilization does not collapse, right? You have, as we've seen in 500, the Justinian plague, and late antiquity had already contracted, but fundamentally this thing drags it further down, and for a significant amount of centuries, the population remained fairly depressed. It took more time to recover. In spite of this heavy blow, right, by 1500 AD, European population has likely reached again 70 million. So almost the pre-crisis levels, right? And it's a huge deal, right? Because eventually Europe keeps on growing, as you know, quite consistent. These are just approximative figures. We're not sure, but this is surely a trend that you can adopt overall, right? So before going on, we have, of course, to contextualize this. It's say demographics is not everything, right? You can have, of course, the data was just so, for example, about say the population 1400 AD was a population living in a greater amount of absolute wealth, but likely less relative wealth on average than the one it was in 1200 AD. It's difficult to assess this too, but again, level demographics naturally alone do not have manufactorially the capacity of describing the period just per se, and we will see it better now. There are all the possible theoretical issues. Again, how do you get the sources? How do you actually calculate this? Because we simply do not know. There is not such a thing like a cadastre or a especially for the whole Europe, that can tell us, oh, we're sure basically of how many people actually live there at the time. It's not easy to calculate even for substantially later times. But there are some say specificities of the European Middle Ages that we can look at today. So leaving aside migration, which is a huge deal, well, for example, when you look at medieval urbanism, you realize that certain rates of growth were enormous, and this was happening not because people were just more fertile, right, and more, making more children, but because people were coming from the countryside into the city, right, or in its outskirts. So that's the major dynamic. There had been migrations, of course, at the beginning of the period, but in general, right, the local number of people remained fairly stationary, right? When you see this data we've just read, there are significant growth dynamics, but they're not so much. I mean, this compared to industrial times, right, they are ridiculous, just like the crop rate and so on. This is pretty obvious, but we have to attempt at least to think, or to calculate the difference between the number of births and the number of deaths, right? That fundamentally dictates the population trends. Pre-industrial times, meaning that, of course, medieval Europe derived its sustenance from agriculture and livestock, and or at least the wide majority of the people are committed to these activities because it's literally the most convenient way on average to survive. And we think, I think it's really not strange, especially compared to industrial times that both the natality and mortality rates were pretty elevated. This is obvious. The birth rate was something. Here we're talking about the Middle Ages in general, so just an average, something between 35 and 50 per 1,000, let's say. The death rate, something like between 30 and 40, right? So given that there is an overall growth, of course, births exceeded deaths overall in the medieval millennium. Which means that in a situation ideally not perturbed by, let's say, external factors, if you let people being there doing their own business, they would have increased in number tendentially with an average of 0.51% a year. Right. This is fascinating because it's been estimated, and these are different studies, so they do not necessarily match overall, but that on average, in the Middle Ages, the actual growth rate, economically wise, of literally of wealth possessed by an individual, there was an average, a peasant could be like just of an extra 4% in the entire life of work, which meant, of course, that you wouldn't even realize essentially that much had changed in the first place, which tells you in a way how poor people were in general, and obviously compared to us, without mentioning that this demographic growth rate is purely theoretical just per se, because there were some sort of systemic or conjunctural factors that intervened to change deeply these numbers. For example, this is not just tragedies, by the way. They were mostly tragedies, but not only. For example, matrimonial practice, that in turn was of course influenced by things like tragedies too, but not only could influence natality. You could have, say, on average, precocious weddings, but especially in a time of crisis, belated ones, because the couple needed to get enough wealth before, right, affording to maintain children. You could have different social, cultural factors on the long term, a change in this dynamics for whichever reason, and then wealth, health, and on the short run, of course, and this was essentially a yearly problem in spite of reserves. I made a video on the importance of reserves in seigneurial economy. The bad harvests, right? But especially because they also were connected to some degree, the presence of epidemics, right? And there is a huge debate also regarding even about the Black Death or Justinian's plague, so-called, was probably smallpox epidemics, etc. On what factors did simply trigger this things, right? Was it merely a matter of transmission? Did the impact originate in progressed sort of the degenerated immunological conditions due to, say, scarce nutrition, etc.? So this is a very important aspect. Wars, right? Killing of lots of people at a time. These were things that could trigger it, and we do not know technically what happened, right? We do not know it even now, right? In 2023, after the last major pandemic. So you can imagine what is our scientific, right, capacity to look into what happened back then. We can at best look at this results, right, the consequences but even those are not properly documented per se. It's just the consequences of the consequences that we're mostly looking at, and quite partially. But epidemics, together with famines and wars, obviously were heavily impacting the natality and mortality levels, right? Structuralistic historiography will tell you it's all essentially a mechanical issue, but of course there is a moral one. The system can collapse for many reasons other than these. Today we do not even talk about climate or etc. These other factors are just conjunctural in a way, but it's mostly humans that can easily mess up everything without, the intervention of some sort of, astronomical cycles impacting the weather or, all this stuff, epidemics, etc. Naturally, those affected heavily the morale as well, and we can very often understand that better through the sources than else. And it's obvious that the Middle Ages were marked strongly, like basically all pre-industrial societies, by the presence of the aforementioned phenomenon, which caused these swings in the population trend. If we were conceptually to find some links, right, conceptually you can think things like war, for example. Start from war. What does war cause? Bad harvest. Right, armies ravaging all around, and people fleeing the fields and not coming back and not harvesting and not having much when they came back. War can bring, just per se, but a huge slaughter, epidemics. Right, it is kind of obvious during great battles, sacks within cities. Those were particularly nasty because they were concentrated in where people lived. Corpses rot, and epidemics really at that point explode dramatically. War, as we've seen, triggers migration as well, right? So bad harvest causes famine, scarcity, right? Epidemics cause definitely diminution of natality, and or at least intended, there are more dead people than before, proportionally. Migrations also tend to bring natality down because people tend to marry less, right? When they are out there on the move, right? They're first to arrive where they want to settle down and start again. So this could happen for small war bands to entire peoples, especially during the migration year, in fact. And this, of course, is true also for the people that suffer these migrations because of wars, resistance, etc. Famine brings to the increase of mortality, just like war, epidemics, the fall in marriages bring just per se to the fall of natality, also because these communities were all substantially regulated from a sexual point of view, and or at least there was a great effort, especially among the elites, to maintain like some, but this was widespread actually, but we have to make a video about that to explain it better, right? We know what pre-industrial societies look like, right? They lasted long enough for us to document them pretty well, and not just in other parts of the world that remain backwards. They are pretty messed up, right? But severely so, right? Incest, rape, violence of any kind, right? They are terrifying. Of course, this varies dramatically depending on the situation, and that's a very interesting point to make also because there is this sense, yes, that from one side we want to think the Middle Ages were just terrible, people looked weird and ugly and were crazy and stupid and all this stuff, alright? Other people instead want to make of the Middle Ages a place where everybody was so cool, stylish, romantic, principled, etc. The truth is something like, not something in between that, but a blend of both, right? And it may be confusing at first, but say studying medieval history, certain things come up, right? It's obvious that the majority of the people are not well documented, and so the poorest ones at the same time. And so, of course, the conditions of moral and material misery that you can imagine among the lower strata of the population, something that you can easily see even today, right? Even in a traumatically and disgustingly wealthy society, under any single point of view, right? There is no doubt that, say, poverty, misery, from a moral and material point of view, overlap, right? And this was always the case. But don't also be fooled by that, meaning that there were some more, say, principled backbones, let's say, at the time, in among the average person that today definitely do not exist. So we're definitely not better people, at least under many point of view. When we think of epidemics, and especially the plague that struck repeatedly, say, Europe, the Mediterranean, in particular in two periods, that is between the 6th and the 7th century, and starting, especially for a good 100 years, from 1348, right, Black Death. So the medical knowledge of the time were not enough, right, to stop with some significance different waves, different epidemic waves. There are some interesting exceptions in medieval Europe. For example, like more or less, Black Death arrives across different years, say some years all over Europe, right? But there are some areas that are inexplicably spared. For example, Milan, some Flemish cities, while the neighbors were dying like crazy. Poland as a macro area. This had consequences, because I think it's pretty evident that in late medieval times there was definitely an increase, right, in just prosperity and in expansion in general among those communities that had not been severely struck, right? We will see this better in some other video, but Poland, for example, has a moment of heyday, and we've seen it recently in the 15th century, because seemingly in the previous one it had not been particularly hit, right? There were more people working, there were more people, first of all, and they could export grain, they could export. For countries were even more developed, they had this still to settle for these imbalances, because the Black Death had shattered a lot of that. And there is, especially an elite connection of late medieval Europe, of the international trade, intercontinental mostly during the 13th, but from the 15th century start seeing, even slightly before, the interdependence of European countries' economies, products, which was not really the case before, right? And I can't quite digress on the reason, but let's say everybody was growing before, now things were running out, and so they had to organize themselves more precisely, more less randomly, let's put it this way. So epidemic waves at some point spread without obstacles, right? That could be in part, the scarcity in population density, but in this sense, in an irrelevant way, because at that point you don't understand why, I don't know, Poland was not struck, and I don't know, the Rus was, or Scandinavia was, right? And if, we are talking areas that were, say, less densely populated to the point that Black Death didn't spread, given that it spread all over Europe, we're really not talking about pretty relevant communities. And don't think that plague was, especially the plague's consequences in the system, were more gentle on the countryside compared to the cities, because at the end of the day, those were really lost made multiple videos about this, also the peasant revolts, etc. As a consequence of the crisis were the peasants, right? And aside from this, the plague had spread among them as well. We observed how generally the coastal areas of the Mediterranean were more severely hit by the plague in the early, like in the late Middle Ages. And next to, of course, what we call plague, that were not even fully aware of what kind of bacilli we're talking about, right? But we know, of course, many other illnesses, such as leprosy, ergotism, scrofula, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, syphilis, etc. Plus, consider all the possible, I don't want to descend into some of the most disgusting things, but just until even the modern age, even the, monarchs had parasites of any kind. It was due to the way, for example, food was preserved, right? But even just because people didn't eat that much, hygiene was. There are completely different population dynamics than in Roman times, for example. Medieval cities, we've seen this massive demographic boom. Medieval cities were much more crowded and populated than the Roman ones historically. And it's not even there, like, we think, of course, of the Middle Ages sometimes, like, as a less hygienic times than before. This is also controversial to some degree. People did bath. There were public ones as well, etc. But this is just most obvious, not necessarily the norm. There were sort of cultural reasons for this, but others are just maybe the way we unsee how different population settlement dynamics really work. In any case, we know that houses were quite promiscuous, also with animals. The working places were also what they were. And there is a general awareness of the fact that many people bore just visibly the signs of illnesses or traumas of different kind, right? Late medieval sources that start being a bit more precise and start feeling even a bit more uncomfortable of these many derelicts right on the streets, etc. That in the modern age would starting being recluded somewhere. But we see, in fact, from late medieval times, from fiscal denunciations, registers of those who had been recovered in the hospitals, etc. There were blind people, lame, amputees, cripples, and then lots of mental illnesses of different times. There were people that wouldn't quite just speak. Others were just fixated fundamentally, the maniacs. They were just mentally imprisoned people, as they were thought, that just the craziest people who had lost memories, people who seemed like dumb in general. So there is a lot there, and we could descend into this in some other video. But going back to the more, general cycles, right, and especially of famines, these were obviously intrinsic in the fragility of the agricultural system of the time. The Middle Ages were not backwards technologically. It seems to us that was the case. We often magnify ancient technologies, but many of them, mostly essentially coming from the Hellenistic worlds, were not actually applied, right? It's very wrong to presume that there could be a sort of industrial revolution in the ancient world just because they had slaves and they hadn't thought about doing that. That's not exactly the reason why the Industrial Revolution kicked in and things changed in that particular part of the late modern age. We'll talk about it on another occasion. And in any case, the greatest achievements of antiquity and the Middle Ages were not really, say, technological, right? They were just moral and massively systemic in what could be accomplished. Even we've seen before the growth of the Roman Empire and more. So it's all a much more nuanced and complicated issue. But there is a lot of technologistic, modernistic, positivistic, modernistic bias, etc. that we're not going to even address against the Middle Ages. So when you can rightly point out, say that agricultural tools were poor, right? That the cultivation techniques were primitive, and so the crop yields were low. Well, there's nothing to be surprised of, right? Most of world history, ever since agriculture kicked in, was fundamentally like that, right? And there wasn't a magic factor that could change this, right? The Middle Ages, in that sense, were quite modern and actually contributed dramatically in the development of forms of land exploitation and just generally speaking of administration and handling of surplus, think about accounting, banking, etc. This all stemmed from an overwhelming agricultural pre-industrial reality, but we still use essentially that kind of mentality. The West in many ways was built thanks to this, and made recently some videos about, for example, the Italian financial hegemony. Middle Ages explains a bit this. I made so many videos about trade and just accounting, etc. That explains how things came to be in practice, right from the dirt or from the sea, actually. And it's not because of innovative technologies that that enormous medieval civilization took off, right? It's just hard work, as always, and enormous motivation. Very approximately, for the early Middle Ages, we calculated that the cereal yields were something like within 2-3 per 1, right? Consider that in industrial economies we're talking 10 times higher, right? Which means that, by the way, a half or 1/3 of the harvest had to be essentially reinvested for seeding, for planting, and means that you have a few remaining, it not necessarily in the best preservation conditions. When we look at the later Middle Ages, we can appreciate, of course, that there were slightly less primitive techniques. For example, the so-called triennial rotation, the introduction of the leguminous cultivations, the adoption of the mouthboard fundamentally, and of a safer yoke, etc. But first, these did not actually spread necessarily in the richest areas and in the most fertile and productive ones, right? Where some of the most backward parts in Europe actually saw the development of these technologies. The way we explained this in some other video, like even the so-called triennial rotation, etc., that there is a huge, it's not that simple, right? Especially the story again of the yoke that was changed. They started using different animals. This has nothing to do with, first of all, it's not true by a large degree. Like, it technically didn't even happen, nor before. We know very much what was going on. But in any case, what practically was changing was beyond these techniques, was just the general conditions of living, right? Say from invasions, moral sort of issues, like, investiture controversy, the development of law, the very overlooked capacity of humans to start over and to start accumulating more surplus and to reinvest that in an intelligent, rational way, and just allowing some other surplus to be better redistributed, and so refining the situation like this, but not because these technologies came around that magically things were changing, right? That's not like, it doesn't come close to even, I think, a minimal part of the picture why that was happening. I will also not digress on how, of course, this agricultural acceleration occurred largely in the moment of greatest spread of feudalism, as opposed to other sort of democratic republican ideas of the freer the people, right, the better they lived. I call BS on that big time, because first of all, it's not true. But it's not true because when you look at when civilization spread the most was actually not when people were freer individually, right? And again, being free doesn't make you that happy, right? It's at some point also why the seigneurial system kicked in, etc. First of all, a consensual choice why this was happening largely, and also because there weren't many other options, right? It was the most convenient one. But you don't have to think that living in the 7th century out there and free and from whom, by the way, right, from someone that cannot offer you protection, so that the next person can come and kill you and seize what you have. And it's not that you just go out there in the nature and survive, right? It's an incredibly dangerous, merciless, exhausting work, and it's not just I go out there, crops start, growing by themselves, and just it's over. I can start having an easy surplus, and no, right? Even without war, without any malice, that's not actually an easy life at all, right? And many people prefer to actually fit within, say, way more hierarchical structures that actually make them live better, generally speaking. I mean, more hierarchical means that in absolute terms you can have actually a higher degree of personal liberty even than somebody that technically has much less of that in a formal legal sense, right? So do not make that mistake. But there is a general understanding that at some point the crop yield increased, like the late medieval times, to 4-5 to 1, which was a significant difference, but we should observe that some parts of Europe actually remained producing more or less the same crop yield. The others even went down. Like there are some places, again, especially that sometimes have been studied just on a provincial basis, right? And maybe they say, oh well, from that country we have that. Yeah, but maybe the neighbors, we don't have any news about the neighboring province historically, and there is no data. There are no sources, and maybe the people were starving there, or at least they weren't reaching the extraordinary level of growth that happened somewhere else. Also, it's complicated to calculate the crop yield of a medieval society because you just don't have the whole picture at all, and especially in this regard. So you have to be extremely careful there at looking at the sources and just making wild approximations to get something relatively inaccurate at the end of the day, but still sort of like a trend, like a direction. And it's one of the most controversial fields of sort of history of economics when you look at especially the Middle Ages, or even other times in the past, right? That it's not the Middle Ages are particularly more mysterious than, say, the Antiquity in this regard. So the consequence of this crop yield was essentially the fact that around 80% of the population had to work in the fields, right? Because without that, you couldn't have the necessary surplus to maintain that 20% that did not leave cultivating. If you think about that, it's powerful, because it's not that at some point they sat at a table and said, okay, well, 1/5 will stay doing something else, the others will just work the land. Also, this ratio, as you understand, could wildly vary But, right, the reason why there could be that 20% at the top doing something else, and not necessarily being wealthy, by the way, is that most people were just by default working the land, because since ever there hadn't been much of another way of surviving, right, in sedentary historical times when agriculture had kicked in. So just the way this basis could provide habitually a surplus negotiated with, say, let's put it in common, to do something, right, to pay someone to train, I don't know, a knight to defend this, to educate this priest to preach us, etc., our Lord to administer justice, etc. This had just come to be, it had always been there, right? And so there was nothing revolutionary or abnormal here. You can't quite say this was the Middle Ages as opposed to any other pre-industrial system based on agriculture. Needless to say, it took, with this crop yield, just a year of bad weather to cause serious famines, right? And preservation was there incredibly important. The role of castles, for example, was also this, right? Having the means to preserve stocks, supplies, surplus, which the peasants simply couldn't do safely. It wasn't necessarily that maybe they didn't know how to preserve that, maybe they knew it better than their lord, but what if a raid came, right? And could the peasants defend themselves? Right? Sometimes yes, but most of the time, say, they prefer to be under somebody else, still maintaining their own autonomies, right? And giving him, for this task of protection, something in exchange. Famines could be provincial, regional, it depends, right? In some periods, for example, in the first half of the 14th century, this phenomenon engulfed in the same years rather vast parts of Europe, and they are concentrated, right? At that point, it's difficult to say what really triggered them. Some say it's climate, others say it's fundamentally just a systemic unbalancement, some sort of financial crisis. It's probably a mix of all, right? It's interesting, of course, to read. Say, usually, that to have a, say, positive bias towards chronicles reliability, which is something you rarely get, right? This is typically, a continental European thing to appreciate chronicles really for what they are, and the fact that you realize that they're pretty accurate in many ways, and there is no reason not for them, especially when talking, say, about the weather, right? When normally these chronicles talk only about political issues. And then at some point, of course, there are social issues. They care about the economy. And every once in a while they say, well, this year we had a hailstorm in July, or snow in August, or something like that. And the crops were ruined, and winter was warm, right? This kind of sense, and there you get that, say, albeit everyone looks at this in a subjective way to some degree, it is possible that had triggered a thing. But when you look at the broader picture, you realize that if things were going a certain direction, and even these changes were impacting the local economy, well, they hardly had a decisive impact on the economy at all, right? And these were also much, because, first of all, the pre-industrial systems are incredibly fragile, especially connected to temperature, right? Agriculture is dramatically affected by these, just by temperature change. But reading these sources, you realize that not even that is connected with general instability. There is war going on practically all the time, at least in the near in the near space, and this say there is never like it's unfair to say that these communities were always at war, but when you realize what they were up to, it's as if they had been, right? They were spending a lot, right, even just to prevent war. And so, of course, a social sort of structuralistic approach always starts from the assumption that there is some strange factor that we just have to observe in the consequence. But what about the causes of this? Right? It's not entirely clear, but from these hints, from these perspectives, we realize that nobody said, oh my god, everything is going down now because of climate change. Nobody said that. Right? Nobody did. Right? And even if they cared about pointing out some change in weather that were disruptive for the crops, they fundamentally wouldn't connect it to the broader picture, and they didn't give it the first importance after all. And they did feel deeply the impact of those losses. There was also, and this is the point, right? There is a general instability in terms of constituted order compared to contemporary times, right? So there was a general weakness of the political and administrative system that prevented for a long time the possibility to intervene effectively to solve these problems. And they would do their best, right? For example, if something was running out, they would look at faraway markets, but it's obvious that just very rich places like cities, etc., could often get this, but that's not even the norm for them. But what about people living somewhere else, right, in the country, more distant, and that could, of course, nor pay nor think to organize this kind of mechanisms? Famines naturally provoked the bad nutrition, fundamentally, of wide swathes of the population, weakening the biological defenses in the face of illness. And just like the situations were strained even in times of economical prosperity for medieval standards, you can imagine in times of crisis, right? Lots of people eating just only cereals, fundamentally, the salaried workers of the great textile industries of the more developed places. There was a big divide. And this was similar to, essentially the countryside, the peasantry, and the nobility in a feudal context, etc. And bear it in mind, with the late medieval crisis, the lower classes lost. Peasants, salaried workers, etc., they did not obtain what they wanted. There is no bigger misunderstanding than thinking that the end of the Middle Ages saw the actual increase of individual liberty. It's the complete opposite of that, right? But I still meet people that actually are convinced of this, and it's a myth, right? It's a modernistic myth. There is nothing to do about that, but just be aware of it. Speaking of war, well, this seemed really a systemic element in medieval society. From the invasions of the barbarian peoples up to the 100 Years' War, you realize that armed resolutions were fundamentally just an habitual option in the horizons of these, common people, right? It was a significantly high level of militarization intended in terms of, the possibility of an average guy having to pick up weapons and fighting at some point. Even compared to, say, what we consider particularly militaristic structures, right? I don't know, 14th century French reality. There are studies on this. Could easily see a greater military participation than Prussia in the time of Frederick the Great, right? Of course, in different ways, but and I'm preparing also a video on this specifically, but still meaningfully in terms of how people were apt to violence, knowing how to carry that out, and so on. Some have spoken of endemic character of war, right? And there's always a reason why they were fighting these wars that actually makes always sense whenever you actually look at it. The fact that these were essentially Christian societies at large doesn't mean much, right? It's a myth to presume that Christianity is pacifistic. That's completely wrong on a theological basis, and it's also an immoral thing, technically. There is a capacity, if anything, to analyze from that spiritual background better what war practically was and why it had to be fought and why it existed in the first place. And naturally, we see a pretty turbulent picture that makes us understand that that's how just the world worked at the time, pretty much like anywhere else in the world. All these negative factors, needless to say, affected heavily on the levels of mortality and consequently of life expectancy, which is yet another delicate datum to assess, because it's not entirely clear how long would just a person live, because there were some critical moments in somebody's life in which was easier to die, aside from external, say, traumatic violence and so on. It was still present there, in just in the type of jobs people had, but mostly because of generalized political military violence. So for the early Middle Ages, it's been hypothesized child mortality in the first year of life of essentially a half, right? We can't be fully sure, right? But in other words, only a newborn baby over 2 surpassed the first year of life, dramatically enough. And notoriously, also among mothers, mortality was, of course, connected to labor, and it was thus very elevated. The main reason being infections, right? The time couldn't quite be cured, because otherwise, mechanically, say we didn't change that much in a biological anatomic sense, but say there was much more natural selection in many ways. The life expectancy at birth, considering this early age mortality, so not really how people would live normally if they surpassed that, was thus barely 30 years, right? Those that surpassed the dangers of the first months of life, they could live for 40-45 years, say on average, like just for, say, hoping that would be the normality, right? Speaking of men, by the way. But women, because of the aforementioned labor mortality, would die actually much earlier. Like, it's believed that 30-35 years would have been at that point an average life expectancy after, the girls surpassed the first years of life, right? There were some dangers throughout all childhood, adolescence mostly. Perhaps there were people living also in early medieval times, we can imagine regularly as an elderly population, of some relevance. But again, mortality, the way people were killed, especially in the elite, that was quite militarized, was another story. It seems, for example, that the Frankish kings, if you look at their chronology, when they were assassinated, they died in battle, they hardly reached 40 years of age. And these were, by the way, the sort of better fed, it didn't mean too much actually, but still they were the more assisted people. So they had even an extra plus of, let's say, support, we can say. The fact that Charlemagne died at 71-year-old was considered, like, of course, there were even older people at the time. It was already a big deal, right? They could have reached that age. There was a sense that the warriors had to die young, at least in the Enterprise, right at the peak of their force, their vigor, their maturity, their, say, balance between physical and mental abilities. But it's obvious that, people would try to live a bit longer if they could. For the late Middle Ages, we find, of course, a higher life expectancy, but not that much of an encouraging one compared to ours. We think that at the peak of the great medieval civilization, so at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, you could have 40 years. Again, as life expectancy from birth, right? So this meant people were living well into their 50s, their 60s, on a more or less regular basis. This went down dramatically with Black Death, right? It rose to the previous levels only essentially by the mid 15th century. And a similar evolution, even at lower absolute levels, was documented, for example, for the English male landowners, right? Their life expectancy at birth was scarcely higher than 35 in the age, say, in the years 1200, 1275. And then it fell dramatically to 27 for those who had been born between 1326 and 1348, which makes a lot of sense because these were essentially the majority of people around when the Black Death struck, right? So these were, still an approximated datum and on a certain pool of sources of people, but it kind of gives you the idea of the drama, the insecurity. Just think of living like this, right? Living in a world in which you've just seen a part of your siblings dead from childhood, and people making more children, even also for this reason, right? Needing also labor force. Just weren't contraceptives, but at least there were, but they weren't that effective nor sought after or needed because that's how life worked. And so just think this at all another level of how you see life, but not just through that. I mean, just think about looking at the night sky without light pollution of some sort. It's a completely different life experience, and it connects you to nature, to the rhythms, to the way these people lived much more intensely than we do, both mentally and physically. And their life were shorter, and part of the whole thing was about this, right? But not all. So all what we just discussed is susceptible to debate. I also myself don't agree fully to everything. It's been said, in general, there are again wide sort of gaps, uncertainties, unknowns, so that's a problem. But it's obvious that poverty and the scarce demographic value of the sources that arrived to us prevent us to look into this even further, right? That's what I was saying in the beginning. You would think that the more you dig, the more you find. Well, that's not exactly how it is, right? There are some levels of certain aspects, certain fields that cannot be, unfortunately, studied because simply the sources for that do not exist, right? At least for our mean of even genetics or enhanced, say, technologies of some kind, will not allow us to know how many people lived out there. We can't fundamentally know that. People's remains are dissolved in the overwhelming majority of the cases. So anatomopathologically we can analyze, say, certain remains, or especially the elites, etc. But it's as if the wide majority of that work had been lost greatly, and we have to rely, again, and I'm a great fan of this concept, mostly on narrative sources to just grasp certain concepts that I think at times are much more eloquent than any actual material find, right? And unfortunately, we live in an age that sort of says, oh, look, we found one guy, so this can tell us about how people were at the time. Well, it's just one guy. Even if you find 20 or 1,000 or 10,000, then obviously they're not going to be concentrated all in a single place. Or even if they are, that can be a problem. Of course, it's you're not looking at the whole picture. And we just have, we don't even have the means technically to have the same people analyzing that. And just we don't know what these people did in their lives. That is forever lost. It's kind of obvious. So people sometimes, especially in structuralism, look at normative sources, law, right? Saying the law says this, so we have to interpret the entire system throughout what the law says. But what the law says doesn't mean what actually happened. So hence narrative sources. Even if normative legal sources are relatively abundant, even for the early Middle Ages, and of course they're very useful to understand a lot of things, they, however, describe a sort of virtual reality. It's how things should be, and how, say, for reasons that are not even strictly regulatory, like there is always a political reason why, for example, a certain law was issued, right? We do not know exactly or necessarily how people would settle matters historically, traditionally, customarily, right? Archaeological research has definitely still a lot to do. There is indeed a lot we can dig out. This is obvious, but again, we can't, even by digging, we can't quite find even a substantially meaningful amount of statistic evidence in order to answer these questions. There is an interesting level of development of epigraphy, of funerary archaeology, that especially dug into numerous graveyards dating to, say, between the 5th to the 7th century. That are, again, very useful, that then Christianization kicks in, so people began to just bury their dead in different ways, and that prevents us from knowing also lots of other things. But even that is not too relevant after all. Up to the 13th century, we factually don't have quantitative sources. This is also particularly important. The 13th century is the moment in which monetary economy kicks fully, and you really have a passage, right, from sort of natural, say, economy, barter, things like that, approximately into some sort of financiary dimension. This is obviously not entirely true, not necessarily even for the entire system, say, great parts of the system. But at that point, you start having something that can help you reconstruct more systemically that world. For the 8th century, the 9th century have the famous Carolingian polyptychs that tell us mostly about the description of lands and families that worked on them. The most famous one is from the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, dating to the 9th century. It's mostly, the Carolingian polyptychs mostly describe as, in fairly good way for the times and places, northern France and northern Italy. Alright. But even about that, they are incomplete. Again, you can have an info about one given province, but not knowing what's happening the next. The Domesday Book for England, of course, in the, say, around 1086, when it was drafted for the Norman King William the Conqueror, of course, provides us with this important, say, list, right, of possessions of a man that, of course, tell us something about the Anglo-Saxon world as well. There is for that even the tribal heritage before, but as we have seen also in other videos, everything is not fully complete, right? And what was written in these books had fundamentally more a political than strictly sensory value, right? So again, it's always the degree by which you look at it. By some degree, you can't quite. You see, the part of the reason why I never studied this disciplines per se is that they are influenced by a sort of Soviet way of making history, not strictly meant, but meaning, just playing with numbers, and that's incredibly boring, historically speaking, because first of all, these numbers are incomplete. So of course, yes, if they were giving us the actual numbers, it would be mind-blowing, to say the least. But these are just attempts, guesses, right? And so if I study the Carolingian politics, well, at that point, I think it's much more interesting to study Carolingian politics and warfare, and I don't know, spirituality, rather than this stuff. The same goes for, I don't know, Anglo-Norman England. I want to study the Domesday Book, fine, but it's part of a broader picture of lots of other things that we know comparatively, and so we can't just go by that, right? Things, of course, go relatively well for the last 3 centuries of the Middle Ages. Consider I specialize in late 13th and first half of the 14th century, so I actually have a privileged cross-section of the disproportional increase of sources, right? When you study the 13th century, it's still like a bit an analytic thing. That year this happened, this year that happened. And yes, there are lots of things already by the 13th century. The 13th century is really the perfect mix, according to some, in terms of, an amount of information that you can substantially handle overall, like in the whole picture of a given time and place. With the 14th century, you start seeing year after year like an explosion of sources. Not quite, say, there are backs and forths like before, for example, the mid 14th century, especially in the 10s, in the 20s, you have a lot of stuff. Then you see a contraction there, but you start getting more, especially in narrative sources. But then you start getting, because there were less people that were just writing, describing the situation, because crisis had kicked in. Fewer people could even afford to be historians, so they were paid to write certain things rather than being just true chroniclers of what was happening. But you start having, in parallel, the strengthening of authority, and so maybe you have registers about the administration. So everything becomes more nuanced and sort of preserved. And it's just even a change in mindset. It's the same medieval people. Like, you understand, these are just the same generations, right? Grandparents, parents, children, right? So it's not that their mindset changed dramatically more than, say, the one compared to our parents and our grandparents in just the last generations today. But they for some reason they decided, especially because of crisis, I imagine, that things needed to be written to literally explain what the hell was going on. We have many fiscal census for many centers of Western Europe and their territories, these districts, with indications of different scale on the familiar nuclei that are registered. Bologna, for example, in northern Italy, with its series of estimates that starts with the 13th century, is perhaps the best documented reality. Why though? Because Bologna was a very popular sort of republican statal city, right? They were inexorably say pro-commune in a way, and so they maintain this sort of older bias in a moment in which seigneuries were affirming, and they, however, became rich enough too in the process for wanting to write in the first place. For France, a source of exceptional importance, it's the so-called state of the parishes and the fires of the kingdom of France. The fires, of course, means the fireplaces, so the various households. That is drafted around 1328 at the request of King Philip VI. And there are, of course, the aforementioned parishes, the fires, hence the families, of the administrative units of the royal domain, for a total of 23,800 parishes and 2,470,000 fires. And increasingly in the 15th century, for all the western part of the continent, we have registers of the baptized, the Book of the Dead, concerning specific urban realities such as Münster, Bruxelles, Nantes, Barcelona, Milan, etc. The Florentine Cadastre of 1427 that provides us with, for fiscal purposes, the list of all the families of the Florentine domain, which is not a few, including those who didn't quite own any property, so that's even more specific. And this, in fact, is, without any doubt, the richest source that we own for a medieval population. Right? Florence, from the Battle of Montaperti, provides us also with actually the only source describing actually a medieval army from the within, and not even entirely. Like you think there is a source for the Middle Ages, right? Of all the armies that existed that tells us exactly how that army was composed from the within. We don't. Welcome to the actual reality of military history. In that sense, you understand that these more statalized, literate, rich communities were the ones producing more of these documents. But just for the sake of that, you have a lot of indenture or condotta contracts, right? But they don't actually tell you what an army was actually made like in practice. At least you always have essentially to rely on a chronicle that tells you at some point this army has, 20,000 men. And maybe, if you're lucky, you do get that condotta, for example. It tells you, that these 500 men were fighting in that 20,000 army, and then all the rest, right? You don't quite have it. You have, of course, there are so many different sources you can cross, right, as a reference and trying to make conjectures and so on. So I do that, for example, as a living. Not quite only. I am mostly a tactical analyst, but I must do that, as you understand, if I want to understand, if anything, what kind of forces were confronting each other on a battlefield. And so it's an incredibly nuanced work. Like, no army in this sense is documented in the same way, nor any armies, of course, same of another. And things change during the same campaign, so you understand, again, the degree of difficulty for sorting out, even with these very powerful sources, what kind of reality was out there. It's a completely different thing, right? Speaking of still the Florentine cadastre of 1427, of each family there is the indication of the movable goods, the real estate, and the different components with the respective ages, the indication of different nature reported in more or less systemic way. For example, debts and credits, illnesses, physical, say, menomations, let's say, craft, profession, etc. There is, however, for late Middle Ages, hardly ever, again, a comparison to these very precious, yet rare documentary islands, we could say, within a frame that rests in great part grey for scarcity of sources. So much so that for the later Middle Ages, we are still particularly uncertain regarding the demographic levels in particular. For example, Paris and Milan at the end of the 13th century. These are essentially the largest cities in Europe. As a consequence, we know they were quite big, and we do know that they were essentially the biggest. We do not know, for example, which was bigger at different times, at least. But just to make an example of the wide gap of the estimates, end of the 13th century for Paris, there are historians that say there were only 40,000 people. I don't think that's the case. Others that say 200,000. For Milan, a swing between 100 and 300,000. So you understand that, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people in difference that we cannot fundamentally ascertain in the presence. There is, of course, as I was saying before, however, a very strong contextualization that accompanies medieval researches and the demographic ones in general. So it's incredibly relevant to look at where the sources come from. That's basically the single most important thing that essentially provides you with the capacity of using them correctly, widening the spectrum of documentation, sources that apparently seem distant from the demographic aspects, but that actually can be quite revealing, right? So when you look at primary sources, for example, you can look at different, just for example, the civil and the lay, if you want, and the ecclesiastical ones. You have administrative sources in the lay world, the supply lists, right? You have literally how many mouths had to be fed, how much food, of course, had to be provided. You have banally the list of people who swear something in a legal sense. They had to witness, sign, etc. There are citizenry decrees, the registers of foreigners, the books of the dead. There are the reformations, the provisions. You have the lists, the membership fundamentally of armed associations, political ones, guilds, right, brotherhoods, etc. Militarily speaking, you have the lists of those who are up to arms, and again, all these sources are not necessarily, you don't normally find them just per se, but this is just for speaking the category here, what you can find. Taxes are, as we've seen, great source of registering, etc. For example, the list of the households, the list of people living in the households. You have list of performances for the corvée, for example, estimates, cadastre. You have a list of those who were essentially to be taxed. You have the taxes of specific goods, such as salt, connected all to different aspects of what that community looked like. Even if you don't have the numbers, right, but if you have just an idea comparatively of how the other communities were around, etc., you can sort of make an estimate, even banally on a territorial size. It's not always, of course, it's just per se not the thing, but if these societies look similar, you can make some appreciations. Ecclesiastical sources give us the registers of the baptized, the one of marriage or burial. Then when we look at, say, there are other, say, narrative sources, for example, chronicles, histories. traveling diaries, remembrance books. But you have other documents, the epigraphies, notary acts. Those are very, very important legally because they tell you from the professionals essentially how things were working practically. The ecclesiastical files as well. You can have, of course, archaeological, topographic sources. You have different, let's say, means of looking at different sources at the same time, or even inventing the profile of a specific source type or category on its own through research, etc. So it's really up to the historian to some degree, but it's important to point out, say, how relevant these numbers are, as much as how difficult they are to concretely assess. I think that's one of the most important things ever. We will surely keep talking about medieval demographics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.